Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this panel, the UN Defining Cyber Rules on the Road, organized by the Washington Foreign Law Society and co-sponsored by the Stimson Center, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank that works on international security issues. I'm Juliana Canet, the president of the Washington Foreign Law Society, which was founded in 1952 to promote knowledge and understanding of international legal issue, comparative legal issue, and foreign law. Given the number of participants tonight, you will be all muted during the webinar, but you are able to communicate with us through the Q&A section. Please send us questions. I know that you already sent some questions in the registration. Keep sending questions to our distinguished panelists using the Q&A section on your screen, and we'll get to your question toward the end of the presentation. The session will be recorded, and you will find the recording in few days in the Washington Foreign Law Society website. Let me introduce our moderator for the evening, Deborah Decker. Deborah is a member of the Board of Governors of the Washington Foreign Law Society and a senior advisor at the Stimson Center. Welcome, Deborah. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Juliana, and thank you to our panelists and our many, many guests online. This is going to be a series on legal accountability in the cyber area, and we decided to make this first discussion in the series a broader look, a look at some work that states have been doing through the United Nations to encourage the development of a common understanding of international legal obligations, as well as voluntary standards or norms representative of responsible state cyber behavior. What is responsible? Coming to agreement on how the law applies and the definition of such behavior is a prerequisite for holding states accountable for unlawful or otherwise unacceptable actions. So to explore ways progress can be made on this path, I'm really happy to have with us today two gentlemen who have been directly involved in much of the cyber work that has been coordinated through the UN. Mr. Bassem Hassan is counselor of the Permanent Mission of Egypt to the United Nations in New York. He is responsible for issues pertaining to disarmament, arms control, and cybersecurity, including the ongoing UN Open-Ended Working Group on development in the field of information and telecommunications in the context of international security, known in UN terms, I have to say, as the OEWG on ICT. So if we say that, that's what we're talking about. Mr. Robert Young is legal counsel in the Criminal Security and Diplomatic Law Division of Global Affairs Canada, where he had international law and cybersecurity, cybercrime and internet and jurisdiction, including the UN processes we'll be discussing today. Thank you both for joining us, gentlemen. I'd like to start by defining the scope of what we're addressing. I'm here because I've been involved in the open-ended working group that was set up by the UN's First Committee. And Bassem, you've been intimately involved with the UN's First Committee's work. So for the audience, and I know I got some questions before this, like, could you give us more context? We're not really involved in this. Could you explain briefly what that means?
Thank you, Deborah. And of course, thanks to Stimson Center and WFLS for having me today. Well, for those who are not acquainted with the work of the UN, there is some sort of a division of labor inside the UN, particularly in the General Assembly. The General Assembly established 6 main committees. Each of them is tasked with a certain set of issues. One of them, the first committee, the one that we were more concerned with in today's discussion, is entrusted with the issues related to international security and particularly issues related to disarmament and non-proliferation, what is usually called the first pillar of the UN, the security pillar of the UN, as opposed to the economic development pillar and the human rights pillar. That, of course, doesn't mean that these 6 committees don't coordinate between each other. There are interlinkages, there are synergies. But the first committee is the one that is mainly concerned with international security questions related to war and peace and the related disarmament and security aspects. And that is the committee that has addressed the issue of ICT from the international security perspective. We will come to that later, of course, but the main vehicles that have been established by the first committee. One of them was the GGE, or the Groups of Governmental Experts. So far, we have had 6 groups of governmental experts, and recently in 2018, there was a decision or a resolution, the UN jargon, to establish an open-ended working group with the participation of all member states. We will come to the differences between the two mechanisms later on, I think, in the discussion, but that's mainly the main committee that is dealing with this issue. Thank you.
So thank you so much for putting it in context. So this has been going on for 2 decades. And one of the things that struck me is the progress that's been made and the differences, the distinct differences between the governmental group of experts and this open-ended working group in which I participated. Where are we today in terms of work? And I know some of the meetings have been delayed by COVID, but let's look at some of the, I mean, what are the key differences and where do you see them going in the future? Maybe, I don't know who wanted to take that. Rob, do you want to jump in on that one?
Sure. First of all, thanks to the Washington Foreign Law Society and the Stimson Center for the invitation and this conversation. Just to add on to what Bassam has said, the group of governmental experts used to number 15, and then it went up to 20. And I guess, Bassam, is the latest one 25 now, if I'm not mistaken?
25. Correct.
So this was an effort to make these groups more, if you like, representative. There is deliberately geographical representation. But the open-ended working group is really an all-comers event, meaning all the member states of the UN can take part. And it's fair to say, when you say, Bassam, at the meetings that we've had of the open-ended working group, in some cases, we've had over 100 states taking part in some of the meetings. We used to meet in person before COVID, and now we will have some virtual meetings this month, informally and more formally in March. So I think one difference is the scope in terms of who participates. And then the other is their mandates as defined in the respective first committee resolutions. But it's fair to say that there's some overlap between their mandates and what they're working on. The open-ended working group this is the first one, as Bassam said, is meant to finish its work by this summer with the report, if we can agree on a consensus report. And similarly, the current group of governmental experts should finish by this summer as well. So we are in the final stages of, in both cases, trying to reach consensus about, if you like, the state of play and what should be done by the community of member states.
Yeah. So I was at the open-ended working groups meeting where they invited in broad stakeholders, and I was really impressed by all the states that were there, as well as everybody from Microsoft to me with the Stimson Center, and that was really unique. And I just wanted to compliment Ambassador Jörg Lauber of, is that how you say his name, of Switzerland, because I then looked at the so-called zero draft, as they call it, of as the committee meetings have progressed. They've put together different versions of the paper that might become the final paper, and to get all the different comments into one document and to say where we should go from here is pretty amazing. I mean, we can talk about that a bit also, but also I just wanted to also compliment Singapore's David Koh, who's the chief executive of the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore, because he chaired that meeting where I think every seat was taken that I could see for the states representatives there. And then you had everybody there from universities to think tanks to private sector, Hitachi. I mean, it was a real interesting communication, time for communication, both in the room and outside the room. But what if then, so here we are, we have these two processes going. We're trying to come to norms of state behavior and how we can implement them and have those norms become some way to drive us so we don't have the next cyber war triggering something else, bigger issues in the world. What are the main differences? Maybe Rob, you can take this, that between international laws and voluntary norms, and what are some of the different ideas that have been put forward by groups? What do we need?
Sure. I think if you wanted to quickly trace the development of the UN processes, at the beginning, there were more questions. Does international law apply? And I think we've moved on past that, particularly with the 2013 and 2015 reports of the GGE, the Group of Governmental Experts. And I think now in the recent years, the discussion is really about how international law applies, which rules of international law are most important, non-interventions, territorial sovereignty, human rights law, what would constitute the use of force in cyberspace such that a member state could use force in self-defense. Questions like this: how does the law on state responsibility and countermeasures fit? I think that's where the discussion is today. In parallel, I think a very productive step taken by the GGE, particularly in 2015, was agreement on 11 what were called voluntary norms. So this is a recognition of, if you like, expectations of good behavior. There is not a claim, there's not agreement that these are legally binding, but that's not the purpose of these voluntary norms. It's meant to say, here are things we should and shouldn't do as responsible states in cyberspace. And I think the right way to look at the voluntary norms is as complementary to the agreed areas of law. And I think agreement about the applicable law is growing each year. So the norms grow up in parallel to those and create, if you like, a wider surface area about what's acceptable and what's offside.
So just a couple of examples of what are in, for those who don't know, what are in those 11 areas that have been agreed.
Yeah, so Bassam may want to speak to this as well, but one is to, not mess with the cyber emergency capabilities of another state. So states set up structures and processes to be able to protect themselves in case of cyber incidents. And it's considered, the voluntary norms say you shouldn't mess with another state's infrastructure mechanism for that. You shouldn't allow your territory to be used for malicious cyber activities. A lot of it, if you read the cyber norms, the voluntary norms, they're kind of motherhood. They're pretty basic in terms of sort of good behavior. And they, of course, reflect expectations of good behavior in other areas. Bassam may want to speak to that, given his expertise in the first committee, where he's looking at a broader range of issues than just cyber.
Yes, I would really appreciate that, Bassam. Would you like to add to that?
Thank you very much. As you mentioned, Deborah, the first committee has been engaged on this issue for over 17 years now. The first GGE was established in 2004. Where do we stand today? The latest successful GGE reached a consensus on a report in 2015. This report, as Rob rightly mentioned, included, the most important part is the recommendations of the report, and these included 11 norms, 8 of which are positive actions on cooperation in certain areas, and then 3 of them are negative recommendations that states refrain from certain actions, from knowingly supporting or conducting activities that would cause damage or disruption, be it to the infrastructure of other countries or to the computer emergency teams, the so-called CERTs of other countries. Egypt took part actively in 4 of these 6 GGEs thus far. We think it was very helpful. The discussions have been very constructive. It brought us those very important 11 norms. However, there are a couple of important nuances there. First, the endorsement of these norms by the General Assembly or the international community was linked to a caveat that these are voluntary, non-binding norms. And in the UN jargon, honestly, in my personal opinion, that usually that states don't have to pay that much attention to implementing them. Secondly, as Robert mentioned, they're quite broad and generic in nature. They're not getting down to the specifics. They don't have any follow-up mechanism to know what states are actually doing, at least at the national level, to implement these norms. The discussion has been going around in circles about definitions, whether international law applies or not, which is, in my view, I think something that we have achieved some convergence in the views about. Now, everyone recognizes that international law does apply to cyberspace, applies in outer space. I mean, the principles enshrined in international law and the UN Charter apply everywhere. The founding fathers, since the very beginning, were speaking about the behavior of states at the international realm, rather than specifying it to a certain scope. Furthermore, I think we need to take into account that GGEs, by definition, usually when a country is excluded from the deliberations, even if there are outreach activities, consultations, they always refer to the fact that we weren't there. The process was not inclusive. You come to us with a fait accompli or a take it or leave it report. So even if there is consensus on its adoption, sometimes when the time comes for taking real decisions, some states say we don't really recognize this as a basis to work on because we weren't represented. I would also like to highlight that in the GGEs, the terms of reference usually indicate that the expert represents his own personal opinion, not necessarily his own government's. So when it came to 2018, there was a proposal put forward, initiated mainly by Russia, to establish an open-ended working group, that it's about time to move beyond the limited exclusive format of individual experts from 20 or 25 countries to have the whole membership having its say. And as Robert rightly mentioned, in the open-ended working group under the able leadership of Ambassador Lauber, we have seen all seats being filled and more than 100 states out of the 193 actively participating in discussions, which tells you that there is a recognition of the kind of threat to international peace and security because of the lack of agreed rules and norms in this domain, and we need to move on it. I will stop here, but
it's a perfect stopping point, because that takes us to where do we go from here, and I want to compliment both your countries for, I was reading, as the UN calls it, the non-paper listing specific language proposals under agenda item rules, norms, and principles from written submissions by delegations. And Canada has the longest submission because it takes some of the language in the proposed norms guidance text and says, here's how we can implement it. I mean, this is like, let's take policies and make them into processes. Excellent. I mean, a couple of other countries all similarly did some good work there. And Egypt, along with, I guess, France was your partner, and it proposed a let's get on with it implementation approach, as opposed to let's stop talking about this. And I mean, we can, as we're getting on with it, clarify some of the issues, like maybe the need for a lexicon, so we don't have these differences. Do you want to, before I go to that though, I wanted to offer Rob a chance to talk about treaties. When I was up there in New York, there was some discussion on, do we need a new treaty or not? And before I bias you on my opinion on that, I was going to ask Rob, where do you stand on that? And Bassem, where does Egypt stand on that? And what countries are really hung up on needing a treaty?
Well, I think the idea has been discussed for years. You know, is this an area ripe for new rules? And to date, there hasn't been a consensus that this is the case. I think we have to acknowledge that the GGE did in 2013 and 2015 come up with some important statements by consensus about international law. And both those reports were subsequently endorsed by the first committee and then by the General Assembly. But the next GGE didn't reach agreement. And one of the points of agreement was about international law. So Canada and quite a number of other states are of the view we ought to deepen our discussions about international law, but it would be premature to start talking about a treaty if we can't even agree in a consensus report on 7 or 8 paragraphs about international law. That's probably not fertile ground for starting negotiations on a treaty.
Right. I can't. So in Egypt, how does Egypt stand on the need for a treaty?
The official position of Egypt, which I'm fully convinced with personally, is that there is a need for a legally binding instrument or instruments in this domain. To get it right, if you're talking about the accountability of states, then you need to have something binding. Of course, we do recognize how difficult the task is. Maybe some gradual steps towards that end goal are required. And that is why we came up with this idea of let's monitor the implementation of what we have first, identify the gaps, see what states are doing, and move on with this. But like was mentioned during the discussions today, you sometimes get puzzled by the type of positions that are expressed at sometimes, whether you find some delegations arguing that international law does not apply in the use of ICTs in the first place. Or interestingly and ironically, saying that you don't have to have binding rules because international law already applies. So why would you develop a treaty? But the real question is, if international law applies and therefore you don't need a treaty, how do you reconcile this argument with the exponential growth of incidents of malicious uses of ICTs by states and non-state actors against each other? What did international law do to prevent these incidents or to hold those responsible for it accountable?
So I'm sorry, go ahead.
I mean, the existence of international law is not in itself something that regulates every aspect of international relations. Otherwise, you wouldn't have had those hundreds of existing treaties there. So I'm not saying that we can do this job right away. It's not an overnight exercise. There's a lot to be done. The technical complexities are there. The attribution challenges are there. But the lack of agreed definitions never prevented the international community from making progress. I mean, we don't have a definition on terrorism, and we have a lot of treaties and conventions on countering terrorism. We don't have an agreed definition of what constitutes a nuclear weapon, yet you have the NPT, the TPNW, and the CTBT, and so on. So I hope I'm trying to make it clear. So not just Egypt, the non-aligned movement and a number of active players are calling for an international treaty. The differences between and among these states and groups of states is about the timing. So we think if you push forward for a treaty without the participation of the heavyweights and the key actors at the international scene, that would make it ineffective. I mean, if you don't have the real advanced country, the really advanced countries on board, then it will be a self-defeating exercise. So we'd rather wait until we make further progress, have some common understanding on key conceptual issues, and then launch negotiations when the time is right.
Rob, do you have anything to reply to that?
Well, I think I agree that I think everyone is broadly agreeing international law applies and should applies. Where Bassam ended, I would certainly agree that it's maybe there's some disagreements about the timing, but I could certainly agree with him that we want to have clear rules and we want to have them enforced. You know, I would say though, two things in response. One is near the foreign ministry here is a neighborhood where I used to live that people also drive through, commuters drive through. And I used to see people going through stop signs all the time, every day on my bicycle or walking back and forth to work. But the lack of respect for rules doesn't mean the rules aren't useful and aren't well known. In the case of what I'm talking about, it was just people who wanted to get home from work faster and weren't really thinking that there were children in the neighborhood they were driving through. So I think if you'd stop those people, they knew they shouldn't have been stopping at those stop signs. Occasionally I would stop and yell at them, and that would start a conversation about compliance.
So that gets us to clear attribution. If you could.
That's right. But you know, the other point is, it's pretty hard in 2021 to say. Well, I'll put it this way. I think an issue is this: do we want to extend the rules-based international order, which is far from perfect, but is kind of keeping the planet more or less on a good day spinning in a reasonable way? Do we want to extend that to what states do in the cyber realm? As Bassam said, we say that international law applies in space, we say it applies in the sea, we say it applies in the air, and that we have all sorts of rules and treaties that govern what you can do in the air, what you can do in the sea, what you can do in space. Sort of as a starting point, why would cyber be so different that the behavior of states in this area wouldn't be governed by the most fundamental rules of international law, starting with the UN Charter, which by the way was referenced in the 2015 GGE report. The fundamentals of the Charter: sovereign equality of states, non-interference in other states' matters, peaceful settlements of disputes. I mean, surely we can't really claim that there are good reasons why we wouldn't want to apply those fundamentals to these, Bassam's quite right, all of these new activities of states or state-sponsored actors. So I think that's where the interesting work is to be done in the short term. And then with greater clarity in the law, sure, it might down the road make sense to start talking about affirming with more detail how the rules apply.
So what I hear you both saying, which is good, is that we're not going to wait, as we did for the International Law Commission, to do its draft articles on responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts for 50 years, or the Convention on Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials Amendment, which took 20 years to get passed, but we can make progress and maybe
Absolutely.
we'll have a treaty. So Bassam, tell me about this new proposal that you have with France and some other states that have signed on.
The idea behind it is an attempt to reach middle grounds. I have to remind you that both processes, the parallel processes, which is creating a lot of confusion, that you have, why do you have two bodies with the same mandate, more or less? But both of them operate on the basis of consensus, which means that any final outcome needs to be reached unanimously. Also, the two mechanisms are deliberative by nature. They are not entitled to take decisions, to follow up on questions related to national reporting or compliance. GGEs and OEWGs are not designed for that purpose. So during the discussions, since it became clear that having a recommendation on launching negotiations on legally binding instruments is not attainable, let's try to move this process that has been going on for about 2 decades now into a different stage. There are successful examples in the United Nations. There is a mechanism called programs of action. It's usually underpinned or anchored upon a political declaration that states commit themselves to a set of principles, and then agree to have regular meetings to follow up the implementation of these commitments. Usually, the method of following up this national implementation is through the submission of voluntary national implementation reports, so that each state comes to that meeting, this annual meeting, for example, with an implementation report that is usually standardized. You have a standard format for that report. We have done this on this particular commitment or step, and then we sit down and review the implementation of these agreed norms or principles or rules. For example, in the area of small arms and light weapons, there is a very successful program of action that has been going on for about 2 decades now. I'm not sure, but sorry. It proved to be very helpful. Did it stop did it combat fully the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons? The answer is definitely not, but it took us a long way in trying to address this threat to international peace and security. It developed some sort of an attribution or a verification modality called the international tracing instrument. Something similar can be done in the cyber. It's not going to be a prohibitive approach. It's not an attempt to try to undermine the peaceful uses or the activities of the private sector, or to limit freedoms. On the contrary, I mean, when we sit down with the representatives of giant IT companies like Microsoft and Huawei. I was personally quite impressed with the level of ambition that they have for some sort of international regulation, especially the horizontal relations between states. They sometimes feel themselves caught in the middle of politicized confrontation that do affect their businesses. And they're calling for legally binding instruments, by the way. And they're coming up with ideas of the possibilities of establishing attribution mechanisms. They have their own knowledge of the digital forensics, for example, and they did a lot of exercises and they have experience in this. So the idea is to have some sort of a modality, a calm platform to follow up the implementation of what is already agreed. And every 5 years, we have a review meeting. In this review meeting, we can decide on the development of further norms and rules when we agree that this is necessary.
Now, two things I would say is, one, I really like the UN Security Council Resolution 1540 construct, which would never happen in this sense, but they have voluntary reporting of compliance with the resolution, and it's totally voluntary, and some experts, I guess there are 9 experts now, I believe, that have put together a grid and fill in the grid. Do you have rules that comply with this? And so that I can see it being like that, but it was really interesting that the experts put together all the little details in the grid that has like 150 different boxes in it. And there was like more general guidance from the Security Council itself. So,
and from these tables of national implementation, further recommendations are developed almost on an annual basis. And then there's a review process that takes stock of these new recommendations, which are sent back to states. The templates of the reporting are developed gradually. That's the type of discussion and effort that we need to be looking at. I mean, just repeating the same debates conceptually, yes, it might be helpful, but we need something parallel to this on implementation.
So Rob, I see you shaking your head. Last time I saw the proposal from Egypt and France, it had about, I don't know, maybe 35 states signed on to it, and Canada was deliberating about it. Where do you stand now on it? And I know
states.
How many now?
48.
Oh, okay, moving up.
I can tell you that Canada supports it. I'm not sure if we're on the official list yet, but I know that we support it. I can assure you of that. And we do so for a couple of reasons. I think Bassam has just framed it very nicely. Instead of having the same debates with everyone just changing the dates on their speeches, as sometimes happens at the UN, it's a lot more constructive. In my mind, agreement on the Egyptian-French proposal for a plan of action, or a POA as we call it for short, would be perhaps one of the signature successes of our current open-ended working group, because it is its practical way to move forward. As Bassam has mentioned, states can report on what they're doing. There'd be tools or instruments developed to make it straightforward. I see it as being able to contribute to an upward harmonization of state actions. States will get a better idea, get inspired by each other, and that could be really constructive. Let me give you an example. Canada, as you probably heard, has what we call a feminist foreign policy. Broadly speaking, we think in the 21st century, that's pretty important. In this cybersecurity area, we've been doing a lot to promote discussion of gender and looking at cybersecurity issues with a gender lens. This is something that Canada's passionate about. So that's something we could include in our reporting, and other states could say, okay, Canada's interested in that. Suddenly there could be a regional meeting, there could be a regional discussion or a bilateral discussion, and maybe Lesotho and Poland and Kuwait or Jordan want to enter into discussion and have a virtual workshop and talk about gender in relation to cybersecurity. And then maybe a year or two from now, some of those other states will start including in their reports something about that, including other issues like views on international law, what's been done by the work Canada's doing to try and create guidance text to implement norms. there are many, many possibilities. And what I like about the POA is that it could be many things to many states, but it's sort of a process where we can share with each other what we're doing to stigmatize bad behavior in cyberspace and what we're doing concretely to add to stability and trust. I would also add that, we talk about stability in cyberspace, we talk about international law, we talk about norms, we talk about confidence building measures, and I think it's fair to say a fourth leg has emerged, which is capacity building. If more states are reporting through a POA framework and discussion, then capacity building needs can come to the fore, and states will be able to identify, hey, this is an area where we need some more help, whether it's technical, whether it's legal, and others can start sharing. And then I see some really positive cooperation and trust growing.
Well, then, so when I looked at the proposal and who had signed on, Britain, the EU, France, of course, and but the other, China, Russia, and the United States were not on the list. Does this have and it was Russia and the US, I believe, who put together the last resolutions that formed the parallel groups that I think is somewhat problematic. I like the Russian inclusiveness. So what's the likelihood of this going forward? And can it potentially go forward just with, the Stimson Center? We support 1540 all the time, or some other groups that are really well, involved in this area.
Is that question for me, Deborah?
That's for, yeah, sure. We'll go with you first.
It's your baby, my friend. So take.
It's not our baby anymore. As I said, now 48 states have explicitly co-sponsored that proposal.
Yes.
And a large number of other countries have expressed support without formally signing up to it. It's too early to judge, really, Deborah, whether this will see light or not. We are from day one, we made it very clear that this is not trying to compete with anybody's proposals. It's just an attempt to try to seek middle grounds. Some colleagues and other delegations initially expressed a lot of enthusiasm, but currently the signals that I have is that there are some questions. Of course, what we have so far is a conceptual framework supported with some ideas on the modalities, but we did not, the co-sponsors did not develop yet a full-fledged document for everything, and we intentionally refrained from doing so because we want to leave it to the discussion that will be open to all member states. But I'm not sure, nobody really knows whether the OEWG and the GGE will even be able to conclude with a consensual final report. There are a lot of differences, and honestly, in this informal setting, I can tell you that there is some sort of a hidden competition between the two processes because of the dynamics behind the scenes. If you spoil my process, I will spoil yours, and in the UN, this tit-for-tat behavior is usually present in the background. Well, so we are not sure. We're open to suggestions. I have personally said that we are not really wedded to the term POA if someone wants to call it something else, but we want an implementation mechanism, a process or a venue for a follow-up of the implementation. And furthermore, this venue will be very helpful in settling disputes, a place where you can go with your complaints, a place where we can have some discussions to prevent certain disputes from becoming conflicts, heaven forbid. So it can develop its own guidelines and agreed steps to resolve disputes. When there is a doubt that a certain act was sponsored by a state, you have a channel where you can go, you can establish some investigations, clarification, and prevent the prevailing attitude of retaliatory measures, of invoking the right of self-defense, and all this. So we hope that it sees light, but it's too early to judge.
Well, you mentioned earlier that Microsoft and others have, are asking for regulation. So this could well be an area that's taken on and supported, if not in the UN, then in the NGO context, in partnership with everybody else who appeared at the OEWG and all the stakeholders. I could see many people doing this on their own if the UN can't do it. It's that.
In my personal view, Deborah, it needs to be conducted in the UN. I think this particular debate about, from the international security aspects and the relation between states, if anything happens outside the UN, then it's doomed to fail. There will be a lot of doubts from many stakeholders. Many countries usually prefer to stick to the UN. It's the inclusive track. It's a place that has certain rules based on the charter and all that. Mm-hmm. There have been some attempts to move outside the UN. You can easily gather a group of states outside the UN and agree on a treaty or a process. But then I think in the previous experiences, it did not really result in that much, at least from the point of view of the non-aligned movement, the G77. Developing countries usually look with some suspicion at these attempts to take place in the OECD, for example.
Yeah. Rob, do you want to add anything to that idea?
No, I think I'll put it this way. I think it would be a missed opportunity if our current open-ended working group couldn't at least indicate some consensus for developing something along the lines of the POA. As you've heard from Bassam, you know, the initiators, Egypt and France, I think are taking a very flexible sort of big tent approach to it. But I think it fits very well with the impulse of many states to let's start being more concrete. Stability is at risk. Let's start being more concrete about measures we can do together to add more stability in cyberspace and make more clear what the rules of the road are.
Yeah,
and, let's just to say, and create more legal accountability by being very clear about what's onside and what's offside. This is where we need clarity, and we need to stigmatize bad behavior.
Okay, I want to get to some audience questions now. Thank you both for that recap of everything that's going on. And I hope that with the Biden administration looking for broader international engagement, and with Putin, with the Russians being the ones who suggested the OEWG to begin with, that maybe we can have a more inclusive approach. And which gets me to one of the first questions. We had a number of questions come in before, with the registration before we got online. And so I just gathered some of them together. And before I get to some of the tougher questions, let me ask you a pretty easy one, because there's a lot of non-state stakeholders who are online, and they want to say, from businesses to NGO, how should or could we be involved in discussions on setting norms and on monitoring compliance going forward? Rob, do you want to start?
Well, sure. You know, the UN has, I would say, I don't want to say a mixed record, but the UN is a large sort of platform for member states. And there really have been diverse experiences about how to engage stakeholders beyond member states, whether it's an environment or whether it's human rights or whether it's cyber. But I think we've, you know, the nature of the internet and the nature of so-called cyberspace is that if we're going to make progress in adding stability, it's vital that actors out beyond states are very involved. And so I think we've seen some positive developments. Just before Christmas, Canada was one a number of states that cooperated with the private sector and civil society organizations to have a series of informal consultations with these diverse stakeholders. And in fact, there'll be another event coming up later this month, a smaller event of the same nature. And so I think we're making progress there in what is essential, which is to have the voices of other stakeholders help states tackle these pressing issues and help us be creative and help us develop solutions that are fit for purpose. So I think we're on the right track, but I think we need to look as we go forward in UN processes about how to create more open doors and more thoroughly, and if you like, permanently integrate stakeholders that aren't states in these deliberations and in the solutions that we have to craft together.
Especially since so much of the private sector is involved in controlling it much more than states can even now. Bassam, do you want to add to that about how NGOs and businesses can get involved going forward?
Well, Deborah, you were there in December 2019 in that multi-stakeholder session that was held under the open-ended working group. Honestly, during that session, as I said, the contributions of the private businesses, the academia and NGOs were quite impressive. We found a lot of common grounds between member states and those multi-stakeholders. The appetite for making progress is obvious. And as I said, when you listen to Microsoft and Huawei and other IT giants saying we want rules, we have ideas for resolving the attribution challenges or establishing some sort of a verification regime, that is quite impressive. And of course, the cooperation between the two is very important. We have been quite supportive of the participation and engagement of multi-stakeholders in the UN processes, and we welcome that. Nevertheless, sometimes it's important to stress that in the UN, when it comes to the actual decision making, because at the end of the day, it will be governments that take the decisions, you need to calibrate the level of expectations from the participants. I mean, there's a difference between participating in the meeting, submitting proposals and making statements, and participating in a possible vote or an endorsement.
Okay. Well, I want to get to probably the hardest question and put them, thank you for that. So we look forward to continued engagement. And I know everybody else who participated is, that we found it very edifying and hopefully helpful to you. We've got about 10 minutes left, so we're 12. We received a lot of questions asking how the existence of norms can deter violations of those norms. And by norms, I mean not only the 11 UNGGE norms, but also someone asked about the Talon Manual, which is 2.0 now, and has gone much broader in its applications. So how can violators of norms, domestic laws, and even treaties that might apply be, first of all, identified, especially given the possible need to reveal tactics and techniques in asserting violations? And if identified, how can then the violators be held accountable for their own behaviors and for the cyber criminals that they may not be stopping? I think we touched on this a little bit, but this is the big elephant in the room. So Rob, we'll throw that one to you.
So maybe two thoughts right off the bat. The first is, 10 years or so ago, it used to be common to say that attribution is very difficult. It's hard to know who's behind malicious cyber operations. And that question, I think, rightly flags that sometimes states, if they discover another state has been up to some cyber mischief, they may be reluctant to call it out publicly if it may reveal some of their own cyber defense, technological capabilities. There's some truth to that, but I think where we are today, 2021, is that I think there's been a shift, and if you like, the balance has shifted, where attribution in its technical sense has become a lot more feasible. Attribution in the legal sense, Deborah, you referred earlier to the International Law Commission's articles on state responsibility. There's a lot written there about legal attribution and how we make, what links are required between individuals who act on behalf of a state. So there's a lot of law on legal attribution. And then finally, the political or policy attribution, which is states publicly saying, hey, we know this was you. That's happening a lot more, isn't it? If you look, just about every month, some states are publicly naming other states and saying, we hold you responsible for these actions, whether it's a series of cyber crime related activities or more obviously state-led activities. So I think the trend there is towards greater accountability. I think that's very much the trend. The other word I would say in this discussion is trust. If states continue to skate around the rules, which are becoming increasingly clear, there will be a deficit of trust. And that's bad for the international community. But I think more and more states will see it's bad for them. If I can't trust you as another state, then will I cooperate in sharing, say, vaccine research findings? Will I be interested in buying technology from your country if I can't trust that it will be safe in control systems in my country? And so I think over time that states that are clearly not playing by the rules we'll pay a price for that. And I think over time we'll see more states seeing that their self-interest lies in acting responsibly and being trusted. And so I think the trend in that sense is growing in a positive sense. I don't know, Bassam, am I too optimistic here?
Not at all, Robert. Personally, I think we shouldn't ever underestimate the importance of having norms and rules, even if we have questions about compliance and verification. I think the existence of agreed norms and rules really deters bad behavior. And furthermore, it discourages investment in malicious activities or the development of ICT capabilities that are mainly developed as weapons or as tools to target the infrastructure of other countries. So work on the development of such rules and norms is very, very important. Any international effort in any domain usually starts with this step, that you agree on stigmatizing a certain type of behavior, and then you look into means to deal with non-compliance.
Yeah.
So
And create greater accountability, legal accountability and political accountability. Yeah.
yeah, but so far naming and shaming hasn't really helped much. And in both, I think it's in the zero draft, and I know in some of the statements that some of the countries made on the earlier drafts, there's a call for evidence. Like, if you're going to name and shame, how do you provide the evidence? And if you provide evidence, then you're showing techniques and tactics. And when I talk to business, like, you know, the platform providers, and they say, okay, we can do some, we can't name who did it. We can say we have indications of who did it, but then it takes the governments and their intelligence services and everything else to verify what we've said. So how do you think we're going to get to an evidence-based solution the way we have with, for the example, the IAEA, right? You have your inspectors agreed, and then it's presented to the IAEA Board of Governors, and then they decide, it's a political decision, whether to take that evidence up to the Security Council. That's a far cry from where we stand today. So, but some countries are asking for, where's the evidence? I mean, how, any suggestions there? I mean, I know you deal in the political realm, not the technical, but it's a question that's going to have to be solved. Okay,
there have been proposals, Deborah. Of course, I'm not a technical expert per se, but I have seen, first of all, incidents where evidence has been clear that traces back certain malicious activities to a certain state, proving that it was sponsored by the state. Second, there are proposals on the establishment of a small body of experts that can look into such cases in a black box format. I mean, a neutral body inside the UN or a special one of the other specialized agencies that can look into the evidence without necessarily sharing them with the public or others, and assessing the validity of this information while preserving the confidentiality, if any. I would like to highlight here that usually intelligence services are not really the ones who are doing this work on forensics, on digital forensics in the relevant incidents. On the contrary, you'll be surprised. Sometimes it's not, usually private companies do that. Giant IT companies and specialized cybersecurity companies that do that work and give it to the relevant security organizations. So the confidentiality of the information here is not always a key issue, but of course, the more that we talk about it, the more that we establish processes and venues that are specially dedicated to discuss this type of questions, I'm sure that it can be done. I'm not really sure, but what we hear from experts is that there is a basis to start from.
Rob, neutral body, black box proposal. I mean, what do you think about that? Well, and we've only got a few minutes left here.
Sure. I think the short answer is today, a lot of states would be reluctant to sort of hand over to some third party adjudication or even investigation of what are essentially sort of fundamental state interests. If you've messed with my state, you've intervened contrary to the UN Charter, I think I may, in other words, if you're stepping on my toe in cyberspace, I'm probably the one who's best placed to tell you, my toe hurts and how much it hurts, and I may be best placed. I think any efforts that will create more legal accountability. Bassam is quite right. Often, some of the malicious cyber activity that's happening out there is so blatant and so widespread that many sources are, decrying it and pointing the fingers. And so that gives us some clues of, I think, where the trend is, which is greater accountability.
Mm-hmm. Well, Juliana, I was going to ask you, we've covered a lot of issues today, and before we wrap up, I'm sorry, I couldn't get to all the questions. Maybe we had given you ahead of time some things that you could post, maybe in the chat or on the Washington Foreign Law Society website, where people can go for information.
I will send now on the chat, and of course I will post below the recording, so for easy reference.
Okay, and you gentlemen are welcome to send to us anything you might want to add to that, and I can also post it on the Stimson website. Well, I mean, this is actually heartening. I mean, even though, attribution is the first thing, then you have to do something about it. And next in our series is going to be actually talking about insurance and the need for, and I think insurance is going to play a big role in this, because they're doing carve-outs for warlike acts, and they want to know who's accountable too. And is this a warlike act? So that may be pushing you faster towards a resolution to some of these issues. But Rob, can I ask you to, if you want to do any concluding statements, and then Bassam?
Yeah, I think I just probably be repeating myself, Deborah. Again, thanks again to the organizers, and thanks to the dozens and dozens of participants who've stayed with us today. I hope the conversation has been interesting. As I said before, I think key is trust and building trust, creating clear rules, clarifying how the established rules of international law will apply, will help make more clear how we all behave well, and also makes clear when those states that don't want to behave well are exposed, it will make the costs for them higher, and may incentivize them to play by the rules increasingly. That's good for everyone. That's good for the citizens of all of our countries to be able to enjoy a free and open and secure internet, and ensure that the technology that is growing exponentially contributes to the quality of human life and meeting all level of human needs in a constructive way and in a peaceful way.
Thank you. Bassam?
I would conclude by saying that, in my view, ICTs are becoming too important to be left without clear rules at the international level. The tensions are quite high. The incidents are increasing, as I said, exponentially, and it's becoming obvious that it's becoming an increasing threat to international peace and security. And our lives rely on these technologies fully. I mean, the COVID-19 has proved that they are becoming part and parcel of our everyday life, and for our children. There needs to be progress. What happened in the UN for the past 17 years until today is quite minimal, to say the least. It's important what we have. We need to preserve that, but we need to expedite the ongoing efforts. Every contribution at this stage, including by non-state actors like the NGOs and the academia and private business, can really give a push. I think it's important to start focusing on the real issues and come up with the practical steps, an action-oriented approach, rather than just being stuck on the same points of differences that prevented progress from taking place. It's clear that a lot of states are actively developing capabilities that are dedicated to, I would say, activities not very consistent with the objectives of the UN Charter and international law. They think that they have an advantage it might be true that they do have that advantage today, but we need to be aware that there is an arms race in this domain behind the scenes, and that these technologies easily proliferate, not just from state to state, but also from states to non-state actors. So what is considered a capability now can be used against that state that developed that capability quite easily. So there is a need for action, and some flexibility would really help on both sides of the aisle.
Well, I appreciate both of your work in this and for being with us today. And I encourage China, Russia, and the US to jump on board. And I have to say that the US and Russia have cooperated in many areas, including Proliferation Security Initiative. They jointly chair the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism. There are certain things where we all have a common interest, and cybersecurity is certainly one of them, including for us as individuals. So thank you both. And thank you, Juliana, for hosting and for managing all this with the staff.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Thank you to the panelists. We keep receiving questions and follow-ups, so stay tuned for the recording of this wonderful event on the Washington for Law Society website. Bye-bye. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Good evening.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. And sorry for the questions that we couldn't address. I mean, I see now a lot of questions. But...
Yes.
Yeah, happy to help follow those up in future. Bye-bye.
Sure.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.